So let's think about why and what we are doing here and why sustainability a complex challenge. So the questions that I pose here, and I will sort of spend a few minutes setting up the stage for our three speakers here, is a question of, can we design sustainable pathways? And sustainability a complex problem. And there we have already an interesting tension. You know, one recognition of complex systems is that they're difficult to predict. They can create lots of unintended effects. They can create emergent, surprising results. And we see that, you know, almost daily, whether it's in the economy, whether it's in social systems, where all of a sudden a social movement springs up in Hong Kong and we don't know what's going to happen. You can ask Carlo, who spends a lot of time in China, what the Chinese think is likely going to happen. But so design and complexity seems to be somewhat contradictory. And what we're trying to do here is find a way out of that, because without a design that is based on the recognition of the complexity of the problem, we won't, in all likelihood, have a pleasant future ahead of us. If we leave the design the way we have been doing it for the last 250 years, where there was a lot of design in technological and economical systems, then we know that we won't have a pleasant future. So the tension between design and complexity, I think, is one of the crucial challenges that we need to address. So for that reason, we then have conceptualized the workshop at the KLI for the next 2 days, where we're trying to address sustainability as a problem of complexity and really try to set the stage for what is, in my opinion, a much needed reconceptualization of the whole sustainability discourse. And the basic main challenge that all our discussions about sustainability have to face, and it goes back to the question of design, is that we need to shift our temporal perspective. Because all too often, the whole environmental discourse and the sustainability discourse is ultimately looking towards the past, because they're trying to fix the problems that we created. And so in order to do that, they're trying to understand how those problems emerged and what could be potential solutions. And what I would argue is needed is a different temporal perspective. We need to look at it from the future and say, where do we want to be as a civilization, let's say 50, 100 years? And from that perspective, what would it take to create and design a pathway that would actually get us there? And that's a reorientation of the whole sustainability discourse, and it's one that can only be done within the framework of complex systems. So the challenge that we face, to just summarize and sort of depress everybody appropriately, is that we have been, for quite some time, living in the Anthropocene. I think everybody is probably familiar with that concept by now. A new, almost official geological era that is characterized by the fact that we, as our species, are the most effective force that shapes all processes on this planet. There is now an endless debate when the Anthropocene started. The geologists want to have a clean boundary that they can dig up and date and find universally. So that makes radioisotopes a big candidate, because you can find them everywhere. So then the Anthropocene started basically in August of 1945. But obviously, that's stupid, because it's a process. And just last week, several papers again published that actually highlighted that already 3,000 years ago, human activities had a much larger impact on the landscape globally than we anticipated. So obviously, somewhere between 3,000 years and 1945, the Anthropocene officially started, and we are in it. What that means is that we are shaping and engineering the planet. And we are doing it without guidance. We are doing it without a plan. And we are facing the consequences. And one of the consequences is, from the point of view of Earth systems science and complex system science, that we can now actually very confidently say that we have left what you would call a safe operating space. So think about it this way. We have this planet, and you know, you're all are familiar now that we celebrate sort of 50 years of the moon landing, the iconic images of this fragile blue dot seen from the moon. So there's this very fragile environment, our planet, and we can define what the boundaries are for us as our civilization to safely operate on that planet. And it has multiple dimensions, of course. And in many of those dimensions, we are pushing or even crossing what you would call the boundaries of a safe operating space. You might, if you pay attention to those things, you realize that it comes about 2 weeks earlier every year when you read in the news that we have now officially depleted all the renewable resources for the year. It used to be in September, now it's in late July, so you get the picture. And what that means is that we are no longer within the safe boundaries. And there are some examples from this year: wildfires, heat wave in Europe, official death of a glacier in Iceland, and you name it. But it's not just the natural boundaries. And I think this is an important lesson. It's also the social boundaries. Because sustainability is not just the question of, do we have a clean environment? It's also, do we have stability in our social systems, or are we pushing against the boundaries of our social systems and social instabilities? So what that means is that we have all those rapidly accelerating developments that we just talked about. We are pushing against the planetary boundaries, and as a consequence, it threatens what we can call the habitability of the planet. If this continues, the question whether we can actually safely live on that planet in the future is a major issue. Might not mean that some forms of humanity might survive, but it might not be the one that we treasure right now. It might be that our species goes extinct. Speaking as a biologist, why wouldn't we? I mean, pretty much every species went extinct at some point. Life will probably go on, but it might not include us. And the important thing to note for the topic that we have here, our window of doing something is rapidly closing, so time is running out. As a consequence, and this might be controversial, what we need to really think about in the context of sustainability and complexity is what you could call strategic design for planetary management. And again, it's this tension between design and management and complexity that we need to address. So the vision then would be for something that would be a reboot or a rethinking of sustainability is that we need to manage our planet for a sustainable future. Now, that is not primarily a technological issue, because that often gets used as an excuse for inaction. We don't really have the technological solutions. We do. So we could, with current technologies, completely redesign our energy system globally based on renewable sources. Wouldn't be a problem. And since our energy system creates the major impact on climate change, that would sort of trickle down and would have a lot of consequences. So it's not a technological issue. Rather, it's an issue what we would call of societal will. Can we get ourselves to commit to doing it? And so there we are dealing with another complex system, namely us and our societies, our financial systems, our economies, our political systems, our decision-making. And so sustainability, from this planetary perspective, is primarily a question about how we change and transform societies to act in a different way than they have been doing so far. Technologies are there, that's not an excuse. And so that's also a way that we have to rethink and reconceptualize sustainability as a problem of complexity. So how can we realize this vision that we basically think about what do we need to discover, how do we need to communicate it, how do we need to organize ourselves, what solutions can we present to preserve that planet as a habitable planet for our societies, while we need to recognize complexity at all scales. That means a couple of things. So obviously, speaking as a scientist, and within sort of a scientific event here and a scientific workshop, it's a question of what kind of science do we need that would actually contribute to those solutions. And that's what we're trying to accomplish with this workshop, trying to rethink the basic tenets of sustainability science along those lines. What the science needs to do, and you will hear in all of the three talks examples for this, it needs to basically recognize and capture the intricate complexity, and now we are starting about it, of multiple coupled social and natural systems. It's easy to say that social and natural systems are coupled. It's yet another thing to really make that stick and turn it into good science. Not just good science that actually then creates actionable knowledge that allows us to address that question of planetary management. And so, as an aside, so there are some issues here that I need to sort of go on a soapbox for a minute. Somebody who has been working in complexity science for a long time, as has Steve here, we are very sick and tired of the following, so that complexity always gets used as an excuse for we don't really know enough, we don't have to act, and it's somehow good if we acknowledge complexity and the alternative of this reductionist science is bad. Let me tell you something. Complexity science done right is the epiphany of a reductionist science. It is a science that tries to find the common principles that underlie complex systems at different scales and in different domains. It's sort of the reductionist dream. But it's a different kind of reduction. It's a reduction that takes, again, sort of the details and the underlying intricate connections into account and not tries to find one single equation that captures all of the universe. So complexity is not an excuse for some kind of mysticism, metaphors. It's really hard science. Okay, end of soapbox. Now let's sort of, the last slide I have here before we get to our speakers is basically let's try to address that question of design and management. And this is sort of feeds also off a project that we had, a large set of collaborators that was based at Leuphana University in Lüneburg and funded by the Volkswagen Foundation, where we really tried to analyze the conceptual and epistemological roots of this sustainability discourse. And the way we organized it is between sort of poles of complexity and control. And a lot of sustainability, particularly in the context of climate change, follows what you would call a control paradigm. So think about many of our friends in the climate community who have some very good models. They're all trained physicists, needless to say. And the models predict reasonably well likely future scenarios under given input scenarios. And for them, of course, the question of addressing all the major problems that we have is very simple. I have a model, I'm a physicist, so I have some levers somewhere in that model, and if we can just adjust those levers right, everything will be fine. This is the equivalent of a control solution. And everybody who knows anything about complex systems knows that they tend to not work that way, which of course raises question of what do we mean by design and management. One of the main features that we learned from the complex systems community is that those systems basically, we call it also complex adaptive system, which implies an evolutionary or a learning component of those systems. And we also know that you can't look at those systems in isolation. So what design might mean is basically that we can set in motion certain co-evolutionary processes and try to set some boundary conditions, but we have to give up the ideal that there is a lever that gives us an exactly predictable outcome. And a major part of complex systems as an evolutionary or a learning system is that it adjusts. So we can't just say there is one decision that we make and we get all the countries together and have a UN summit and then decide something and then we are done. You know, we decide it has to be 1.5 degrees, okay, done, what's the problem? No, it's a constant adjustment and a constant learning and a constant evolutionary process. And there's one additional caveat, and that's sort of one that's sometimes difficult to swallow for scientists like me. I had to get used to this. We have to accept that we have to make decisions without knowing everything. We have to act based on incomplete knowledge, and that gets us in another tenuous position because it means that there is an interesting feedback between what we know about the systems, we make a decision, we intervene, it changes what we know about the systems, we have to live with this uncertainty. So some of you in Vienna, you might have heard Helga Novotny talking a lot about uncertainty and how to handle uncertainty. And I think this is another thing that we need to really incorporate into our emerging new conception of sustainability. Okay, so this is sort of trying to set the stage, and now I shut up, and we have three really interesting brief presentations here in the following order. Carlo Jäger, Maya Schlöter, and then Steve Lansing. They will talk about very connected but different things, showing the diversity and complexity here. Carlo will talk about institutions, particularly also global institutions and economical and financial institutions. Maya will talk about specifically how we can navigate the problems of collapses and transformation, because it's not that those transitions that we are talking about will be nice and pleasant all the time. There will be interesting non-linear effect, as we call them. And Steve will give you, based on his many decades of research in a particular environment, sort of loosely defined as the tropics, give you some very great illustrations about how those systems self-organize and how we better pay attention to what we know about how those systems self-organize when we start intervening and designing. So that's the sequence. So, and after those talks, I hope you write down your questions so that we will then have a panel discussions among us, but hopefully with the audience, and ideally with questions already coming in.